Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all see me. Welcome to this short lunchtime talk. My name is Michael Nevin, and today is December the 5th. It's a rather dreary and dreary day here in Edinburgh, but I'm nicely in the warm, as I hope you all are. So I'll give a brief introduction to my new book, Reminiscences of a Jacobite, for 15 minutes, and then invite any questions, either by microphone or equally, you can also use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So today, December the 5th, it's the 275th anniversary of the Council of War at Derby, which was a turning point in the Jacobite Rising of 1745. Before the Council of War, the Jacobites had never retreated. After the council, they were never again to advance. And as we know, their campaign ended in catastrophe at Culloden just over 4 months later. So one of the eternal truths of human endeavour, whether it be in business, sport, politics, is that it very rarely pays to abandon a strategy you worked out to offer your best chances of success halfway through, as the Jacobites did at Derby. And that's one of the many enduring truths about the human condition that emerges from the story of the Rising. Others that come out of the Reminiscences, chapter 3, the tragedy of Queen Anne. A family is more often destroyed by internal splits than by external misfortune. Chapter 4 covers the Battle of Glen Shiel. If you treat a defeated enemy with respect and with restraint, you could, as General Whiteman did after Glen Shiel, build the foundations of a lasting and enduring peace and rapprochement. On the other hand, if you seek vengeance, as the Duke of Cumberland did after Culloden, then you're likely to leave a legacy of bitterness and greater problems later on. Other lessons of the 45 come from the Council of War at Derby itself. You shouldn't listen to intelligence given to you by strangers whose agenda you don't know and who may well be supplying you with false intelligence. Chapter 11, the financing of the revolution. If you want to crush an insurgency movement, you do not have to sacrifice the lives of many thousands of brave soldiers on the battlefield. All you have to do is choke off the insurgents' supply of funds. Chapter 14 on the execution of the Jacobite lords. If you think about those you leave behind you, then you may leave an enduring legacy even after you've gone. So, the Reminiscences of a Jacobite are being published to mark the 300th anniversary of perhaps the most controversial figure in British history, Prince Charles Edward Stewart, condemned by some as a reckless gambler who risked everything on a bet that he could not possibly win, admired by others as an unlucky hero fighting for a just cause that merited victory and might have changed history much for the better. His tricentenary is perhaps an appropriate moment to reassess his career, his character, and his legacy, and to consider whether the conventional view of him as an irresponsible and inept adventurer is entirely fair. So, the word reminisci comes from the Latin reminisci. It means to remember or to recollect, but reminiscences in contemporary English has a meaning that goes deeper than this. They are memories, certainly, but they're memories casually, often nostalgically, sometimes poignantly recollected by a narrator about events long past. And so you might be forgiven for thinking that the Jacobite, and the title of the book, Reminiscences of a Jacobite, is its narrator, namely the book's author, myself. And to some extent that is the case, but only incidentally, insofar as it recalls my own odyssey through the remarkable story of the Rising of 45, with the help of friends and colleagues in the 1745 Association. More fundamentally, the reminiscences are intended to be those of the man whose statue is on the cover of the book, Prince Charles Edward Stewart, more popularly known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. And the primary source of his reminiscences that I use is his own memorandum. That's a reproduction of it on the wall behind me. This was a memorandum he wrote to Louis XV of France immediately after his escape there in October 1745, and it's dated November the 5th, 1746. And he appeals to the king in the memorandum for his support to raise a force of 20,000 men to go back to Scotland to finish the campaign that he began. I secured it from the heirs of Louis XV's foreign minister, the Marquis d'Argenson, in 2002. And it gives a very different version of the events of the Rising than that set out in conventional histories of the time. And it certainly is evidence against the Hanoverian propaganda that the prince abandoned Scotland after Culloden. What he actually did was return to France with a clear intent of raising more men to go back and finish what he saw as the unfinished business of the 45. To further understand the prince's thinking, I drew on his public declarations and private conversations with his closest allies, including his right-hand man, Colonel John William O'Sullivan. I drew on poems and songs of the time, including The Day of Culloden, which was composed by his most faithful partisan, John Roy Stewart, while the two men were together in hiding on Ben Alder in late 1746, and on private correspondence and unpublished sources, including the letters of Mrs. Anne Pritchard. And all of these sources indicate that so far from seeing Culloden as the end of his campaign, he saw it rather as a temporary setback, rather like the defeat of his great uncle, Charles II, at the Battle of Worcester, which ended with the restoration of Charles II some years later for what was quite a successful reign. So, the Reminiscences of a Jacobite comprise three sections, each of 6 chapters. The first section considers the underlying cause of the Rising, dating back to 1689, when James VII and II, the prince's grandfather, was deposed by his son-in-law, William of Orange. Conventional histories describe this as a largely bloodless revolution. In fact, it wasn't a revolution, it was a coup. It wasn't glorious. It was a rather squalid family squabble over the inheritance, and it certainly wasn't bloodless. There were multiple battles in the Williamite Wars, but they were all in Scotland and Ireland, and since none of them were in England, they could be conveniently overlooked by the Whig historians writing from the comfort of their rooms in London, Oxford, and Cambridge. So one person who apparently emerged victorious from this struggle was the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne. Yet her political triumph was only achieved at great personal cost, destroying her own dynasty and denying the throne to her half-brother, James Francis Edward. James's attempt to win back the throne resulted in yet more conflict, including the largely neglected Battle of Glenshiel, analysed in the book's 5th chapter. After that defeat, James more or less abandoned his attempt to regain the throne, his innate pessimism reinforced by the death of his beloved younger sister, Louisa Maria, and by difficulties in his own marriage and the early demise of his wife Clementina, which was a traumatic event that shaped the character of her son, Prince Charlie, who was just 14 years old when she died. The second part of the book covers the Rising of 1745, drawing on the prince's own account, his public declarations and proclamations, his private conversations, contemporary portraits of his appearance at that time, including the one on the wall behind me, reduced, attributed, I should say, to Alan Ramsay, undoubtedly of the Prince, and dated October 1745 when he was here in Edinburgh. And the final source is the private accounts of his supporters. And all these accounts reveal a man who believed, as he reflected on his time in Great Britain, that it marked not the end of his hopes, but a temporary setback that could soon be reversed. And they also reveal that so far from being the weak and reckless adventurer of Hanoverian propaganda, the Prince was a charismatic commander-in-chief with a clear and credible strategy to win the throne. And it was this that convinced experienced and intelligent men with much to lose, and with characters as varied as Lord George Stewart, Lord George Murray, Colonel John William O'Sullivan, the Duke of Perth, Lochiel, and the other clan leaders to risk everything they had by supporting his cause. Everything started to go wrong today, December the 5th, at Derby, 275 years ago to be precise. That was when the fateful decision was taken to turn back to Scotland instead of continuing the advance onto London. Thereafter, the Jacobite army progressively disintegrated as its money ran out, culminating in the final disaster of Culloden. The final part of the book looks at the aftermath of the rising, telling the story of the Prince's own escape after Culloden. And meanwhile, the Jacobite lords, Balmerino, Kilmarnock, and later Lord Lovat, faced their fate on the scaffold at Tower Hill with considerable courage, and their book recalls their thoughts as they faced their imminent deaths. The thoughts of the Prince himself on the defeat are captured in the Gaelic narrative poem, The Day of Culloden, composed by John Roy Stewart during the period when the two men were hiding together on Ben Alder, and then during their voyage back to France and to safety in the autumn of 1746. And it's my contention in the book that the evidence we have proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the Prince still believed when he sailed from Scotland that he could win back the throne as his great uncle Charles II had. He only really gave up that aspiration after the final blow, which came with the Elebank plot in 1752. After that, the Prince's career as a public figure of any significance was over. His progressive psychological and physical disintegration over the next 36 years of his life was a personal tragedy, but had little wider political importance. Yet now, as we approach the 300th anniversary of his birth on December the 31st, 1720, is not the time to remember him as he was during his long and sorry decline, but rather as he was when he was here in Edinburgh in October 1745, aged just 24, at the height of his power and his hopes, a vigorous, valiant, victorious, and visionary figure who initiated the most audacious attempt in British history to regain the British throne, and who very nearly succeeded. So that concludes my introduction, and I'm now happy to take any questions. Either you could type them on the chat, Zoom group chat, or if anyone wishes to unmute their microphone and ask something. I can't, unfortunately, because there are 35 participants, I can't see everyone on my screen, which might make it slightly difficult if more than one person wants to ask a question, but I'll open the floor for any questions that you may have.
May I lead off, Malcolm Healy? Okay. I went to the Jacobite expedition with my daughter when we went to the Tattoo a couple of years ago, and I thought it was a great exhibition and set out. I wondered what your opinion of it was. I didn't recall any indication that it was just a setback, for instance, as you mentioned.
The Well, the exhibition itself, the one at the National Museum, is that the one you're referring to?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a very good exhibition because it had a lot of important Jacobite artifacts, including some I hadn't seen before. For example, the block on which Lord Lovat was executed. So, in terms of the artifacts, there it was a very good exhibition. However, you're quite right that the story it told in the narrative section was very much a conventional story. It was a rather reckless adventure. Culloden was the end, and the prince then abandoned Scotland was the impression we've got, which, as I say, I think is completely wrong, and which I challenge in the book. But nevertheless, the exhibition itself, I think the National Museum is to be commended because they brought together a fantastic array of artifacts, many in private ownership as well as those in the public collections. So I personally enjoyed and appreciated it, I have to say. And I think from the National Museum's point of view, I think it's regarded as quite a successful exhibition. Those of us who don't agree with the Whig narrative of history have to continue to challenge it, but I don't want to say anything negative about the National Museum's exhibition.
We certainly enjoyed it. We went round in Scottish attire before the tattoo with an Indian colleague of mine called Binod. So I was involved in a sort of sub-explanation that I was attempting to bring clear for him, which I think failed royally. Thank you.
May I ask a question? It's Aidan here from Newcastle.
Mm-hmm.
The memorandum that you've used for your book, has it been published, or do you intend to sort of publish a facsimile text or something like that?
So, I'll bring it down. This is a memorandum facsimile of it.
I assume it's in French.
In French. It's in French. Yes, the prince spoke very good French. It is in the book. So it's in my...
Oh, the complete text.
The complete text is in the book. It's reproduced in the book. I've received it there. It hasn't previously been published, as far as I'm aware. But that's one piece of evidence. There are other pieces of evidence. One is the narrative of John William O'Sullivan himself, when the two men are on the run in June 1746. Before they leave, the story is that they're traveling incognito as Master and Mr. Sinclair, father and son. The prince says, look, we've got to part. I've got to go back to France and raise more men to come back and finish and continue the campaign. So that's O'Sullivan's narrative. There's the letter he wrote to the clan chieftains where he tells them, I'm going back because I'm persuaded that I'm of more use back in Paris talking to the king to persuade him to give me more support to go back to Scotland. Further bit of evidence, I'm just reading it at the moment. This is volume 10 of the memoirs of the Duke de Lune, who was a senior courtier at King Louis's court. And he says he meets the prince. In fact, he invites him to dinner in October 1746 with his entourage. The prince is very determined to return to Scotland. This has never been cited. This memoir, this is volume 10, so you can see this is his diary, basically, of a senior courtier at King Louis's court. Never been translated into English, never been referenced in any English book of which I'm aware, but a first-hand eyewitness account of meeting the prince when he got back and saying this man is determined to go back to Scotland. And of course, he then presses to try and meet the king. He's on a sort of charm offensive in October 1746, and I'm reading section now. Apart from being entertained to dinner by the Duke de Lune and Cardinal Tensing and many other senior figures at the court, one of the other senior figures he meets and is entertained by is Madame de Pompadour, who's a very influential figure at the court at this time. So there's overwhelming evidence. The prince had one idea and one idea only in his head, which was there's no point hanging around in Scotland anymore. I need to get back to France and get the support of the French king to raise more men to go back and finish the job.
Thank you.
Michael, I wonder if I could ask Richard Knight here, masquerading under my son's name in the account, so that's Richard Knight. I just want to pick you up on this idea that you're putting forward, that Bonnie Prince Charles was determined to keep prosecuting the ambition of returning to Britain and claiming his inheritance. During the months after Culloden, some of the previous leaders of or his assistants in the uprising were trying to foster a continuation of the rebellion. I'm thinking of Gentle Lochiel, John Murray of Broughton, Major Kennedy. People like this were trying to keep the flame burning, but seem to have got precious little encouragement from Bonnie Prince Charles himself. And I wonder what you think about that and how it sort of marries up to the idea that he was still trying to carry this flame forward.
Well, there was an attempt, including by John Roy Stewart, after the Loch Arcade gold landed from Spain. They thought they had enough money and we can continue the campaign. So there was an attempt. I think the Prince himself was more realistic. He said, look, we've been beaten, we've run out, basically by Culloden, they've run out of money. They didn't have any, the men who fought at Culloden hadn't had anything to eat for a couple of days. So they just did not have any resources left. And I think there were those who thought they could continue a campaign in Scotland. I don't think the Prince agreed, obviously didn't agree with them. He thought, no, we just don't have resources to do that. That doesn't mean he'd abandoned his hopes of getting the throne back any more than Charles II had after he left Great Britain after the Battle of Worcester. What it meant was, in these current circumstances, we don't have much chance of success if we just continue a guerrilla campaign in Scotland. And to be honest, I think he was perfectly right in that. It's clear that they just run out of money. They'd run out of supporters within Scotland. They were in a desperate state. So the idea that you could continue a sort of long-term guerrilla campaign in Scotland, it would have just led to a wholly avoidable loss of life. So yes, it's true that there were some Jacobite diehards, Lochiel, there was Cluny Macpherson, there's John Roy. They wanted to continue the campaign. But I actually think the Prince's judgment was sounder, that it wasn't credible, wasn't sustainable to continue the campaign in the way that they wished.
Alan McLean. I'm from Clan McLean, France. I happen to be in England today. May I ask a question? Would it be true to say as a conclusion that we failed because the French were not supportive enough before Culloden, and secondly, due to the choice of the Culloden battlefield, and I believe that Lord George Murray was totally against fighting on that field, although I believe that O'Sullivan was in favour of doing so and persuaded the Prince to fight.
Mm-hmm. On the Culloden, I agree. Lord George was, in my view, undoubtedly the outstanding battlefield commander of the 45. And his judgment was we shouldn't fight in this field. It's not fit for Highlanders to fight on. The Highland charge requires a downhill charge at the enemy. This is a swampy, flat field, and his judgment was proved correct. I think the view that the Prince, maybe O'Sullivan, if you read his narrative, we've either got to give up or we've got to fight. This is a desperate last stand. So I agree with you on Culloden. I do not agree with you on the French support. The Bonnie Prince had not consulted at all with the French before he left. He went off, it was a unilateral initiative on his part. He hadn't consulted with his father either. The reason he hadn't done so, in my view, is because he knew what their answer would be. Do not launch this campaign at this moment. He'd have been dissuaded from it. He didn't want to hear that. He said, no, I'm going to go. Having gone, his younger brother then, Prince Henry, comes up through Avignon to Paris. He meets with King Louis on October 24th, 1745. And that is the date of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, drafted by Voltaire at the request of his friend Marquis d'Argenson, who was the French foreign minister, committing French support to the campaign. After that, the French, let's see what they did. They send over Lord John Drummond and the Royal Écossais. They send over the Irish pickets and the Brigadier Stapleton. They fund them, they equip them, very heavy cost. They tried to send over more soldiers on the Espérance, which included Charles Radcliffe, the titular Fifth Earl of Derwentwater. They got captured. Radcliffe was the last Englishman to be beheaded at Tower Hill in December 1746. They send over gold and supplies, in particular on the Prince Charles, many millions of pounds in today's money. They committed a very substantial support to the Prince in late 1745, early 1746. Without the French support, the Prince, in my view, would not have survived. He wouldn't have got out of Scotland. The French again sent ships over after Culloden to get lots of the Jacobite leaders out of Scotland, again at great cost. What then happened in 45-46 was unequivocal French support for the Jacobites. By the time the Prince wrote his memorandum in November 5th, 1746, and he was having his charm offensive with Madame de Pompadour and so forth, it had changed. It had changed because basically the French public finances were in a ruinous state. They were trying to sue for peace on advantageous terms with Great Britain. They were fighting the Austrian War of Succession. They were fighting Great Britain. They were fighting Austria. There were wars in Italy, Spain. If you read de Loome's memoirs, which are from the centre of the French court, there were huge commitments that France had. And Madame de Pompadour, who was the most trusted advisor of the king, I think was trying to save him from himself and saying, look, I like Bonnie Prince Charlie, but we cannot keep affording to spend this kind of money. We're going to destroy the French state. And there are so the pro-Jacobite camp, which was led by d'Argenson, supported by Cardinal Tensing, d'Argenson lost office in January 1747 with his younger brother, who was a minister of war. So the pro-Jacobite party within the court then lost power. And after that, it was basically, let's do it, let's get a peace. The other thing was they captured Brussels in February 1746. So basically their strategic objectives have been achieved as far as France was concerned. So I think the French gave all, and I've heard this from other Scottish historians, the French let us down. The French did not let Scotland down at all, or let Bonnie Prince Charlie down at all. They gave huge support to the Prince, hugely expensive support. It all ended up at the bottom of the North Sea. So as far as the French were concerned, they just could not keep committing money to this campaign. You've got to see it from the French point of view. I think they acted rationally and reasonably. It wasn't from any malice against the Prince, it was just from the interests of the French state. And we now have ended. The Prince got expelled from France after the signature of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. So, but at the time of the Rising, with the support of the pro-Jacobite party in Versailles and Fontainebleau, they were in the ascendancy, and the Prince got all the support that could reasonably have been expected in that period, I think, between the signature of the Treaty of Fontainebleau in October 1745 and the escape of the Prince and his arrival in France in October 1746. So that 12-month period, tremendous support from France, in my view. Yeah. So we've got about, I think, 5 minutes left. Sorry, carry on.
Can I ask you a question, Mr. Nevin? My name's Charles Stewart. I come from Marisham. I've always been very disappointed in the results of the Ardassia raid, well-intentioned, but absolutely disastrous from the point of view of the fighting spirit of our army on the eve of the battle. To what extent would you say that our Prince was responsible for this, or was it someone else?
The night march on Nairn?
Yes, exactly.
Well, again, my view is that tactically that was actually not a bad idea, and it was the idea of, again, Lord George Murray, who I think was as I say, the outstanding battlefield commander. He's a difficult person to work with at times. He's quite a proud man, but in battlefield situation, he was the man to follow. The problem with the night march on Nairn was not the idea behind it; it was the execution. The execution, they had two different columns, one under Lord George, one under the Prince, and they lost contact with each other. They literally got bogged down in the advance on Nairn, and come the break of dawn, Lord George hadn't achieved his mission, so he unilaterally took the decision to turn back. And this led to a huge row with the Prince and with John Roy Stewart. His colonel of the Edinburgh Regiment. But the actual idea, I think, actually was a pretty good idea. It's just the execution was meant to be a Preston Pans Mark II sort of commando raid on the enemy, but it was the execution that was a problem. And obviously, then the army was exhausted. It was starving. Some of the men went off to look for food, and then they made the second decision. Never mind, we'll stand at Culloden. And even in his narrative, O'Sullivan says, well, the men were exhausted. They were hungry. They were worn out after a night's march. There was no way they were going to win that battle. So The night march itself, I think, was a good idea, but it was the execution was poor, and obviously the decision to stand at Culloden the following day was poor. That would be my view of it.
Yeah. To what extent was the prince responsible for that final fatal decision?
No, he's got to take the blame for that, because it was his decision to stand at Culloden. It wasn't Lord George's decision, and he has to take. He's a leader. He has to take the final responsibility. My view is that the prince had a lot of heroic qualities. He's very charismatic. He's very visionary. But he had one fatal flaw, and that was what I call it Bonnie Prince Charlie syndrome. He saw the world as he wanted it to be. He didn't see the world as it was. Big mistake. And at Culloden, he thought, my Highlanders, they'll never be defeated. They're undefeatable. That's the way he saw the world that he wanted to see. And I've come across people in business like that. And they're very visionary, they're very inspiring, they can achieve great things, but you've got to be very careful not to be swallowed up by their own vision of what the world should be like. So that's it. I don't know how we're now approaching 1 o'clock. I'm happy to continue to take questions. However, in my experience, at some point Zoom will come and cut us all out. So I'll just pre-warn everyone. But I'm happy to continue if everyone here is for another 5 minutes. Take the risk if there are any more questions.
Can I ask, were intelligence failings almost inevitable in those days, so that the French support could not have been exploited because of difficulties of several days of transmission of information? Could you comment generally on that? Because really, comms then were not, a very high quality item.
Exactly. No, that's a very good point. And that, with the anniversary of Derby, at the time of Derby, Prince Henry was in titular command of a French force of 11,000 men at the Channel ports under the operational command of the Duc de Richelieu. And the Prince said the French were just coming over. Now, he had no way, we didn't have mobile phones, so they didn't know that. Lord George and the clan leaders didn't believe him. They said, well, we've heard these stories before. Had we got modern communications, they'd have known. We've got a major French expeditionary force of 11,000 men, another big commitment by the court of King Louis, at the Channel, and they're only waiting for the fog and the mist and the tides to try and evade the Royal Navy. The people who saved King George were the Royal Navy, no doubt about it, because they choked off the supplies coming from France to the Prince Charles. They also stopped the French expeditionary force from crossing the Channel. Now, that was a specific example of intelligence, but there were other breakdowns of intelligence. But that was the most fundamental one. That at Derby, conversely, they were listening to Dudley Bradstreet, who's giving them entirely false intelligence about a big government army outside London, which didn't exist. So yes, the Jacobites suffered from lack of intelligence, whereas obviously the British army, the Hanoverian army, had more complete intelligence because they were more unified.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I've someone sent in a Groom chat that possibly we won't have the session terminated in 40 minutes. So if there are any more questions, we're going for another 10 minutes. So I don't want to intrude on people's time and lunch, but we can certainly continue till 10 past and then maybe stop then. Any more? If there are any more questions?
Mike, you suggested the final undoing of Bonnie Prince Charlie was the Elebank plot. Would you like to speak a little bit more on that?
So again, it's in the book, and I don't want to spoil the denouement, but essentially what happened was Prince Charlie is expelled from France in 1748. Because it's in French national interest now to arrive at a peace treaty with Great Britain, and under the terms of the treaty, under the Treaty of Fontainebleau, they recognise the Stewart claim. Under Aix-la-Chapelle, they recognise that King George and the House of Hanover are legitimate kings of Great Britain and Ireland. But Prince hasn't given up his hopes of recovering the throne. He returns. He still has considerable support, including Alexander Murray of Elebank. Elebank hatches a plot to basically kidnap King George and his family in 1752, with the help of 2,500 men from the Ogilvy Regiment. On the night in question, the men don't turn up. So Elebank is worried. He thinks he's going to suffer the same fate as Guy Fawkes. So he tells people, I'm going to get out of Britain and I'm going to France to consult with the Prince. Now, I don't want to give away too much about the book. What then happens, in my view, and we didn't know about this until letters came to light by a lady called Mrs. Anne Pritchard. The Prince comes over to London at Christmas of 1752 and stays at the home of Lady Anne Primrose, where Mrs. Pritchard is then a young woman. She's working in the household, and she tells a story. And basically, a cathartic event occurs. He goes out one morning and sees the severed head of Colonel Francis Townley of the Manchester Regiment on a spike at Temple Bar. What happened to the executed Jacobites after the Rising was their heads were put on the spikes at Temple Bar. Dr. Johnson, for example, refers to this. It's just a warning. You know, if you guys keep trying this, this is going to happen to you. So that was shocking event number one. Shocking event number two was, as part of the plot, Dr. Archie Cameron is sent to Scotland, ostensibly to try and recover the Loch Arcade gold, in fact, as well to coordinate Jacobite activities in Scotland. He's captured, he's betrayed by Pickle the spy, and as we know, he's hung, drawn and quartered, a particularly cruel and unusual punishment, and it even shocked the people of London at the time. And he's not tried. It's a general act of attainder that occurred, that applied in 1746 to all Jacobite leaders. So the Hanoverian government didn't bother with anything as risky as a court case against him. They just executed him in a particularly cruel way. Again, a big warning. This is what will happen to you if you back Prince Charlie. Dr. Cameron is buried in Savoy Chapel. He is laid to rest there at midnight after his execution to avoid public unrest. Because even by the standards of the Hanoverian government, what happened to him? He wasn't actually a combatant. He was a non-combatant. He was a medical officer. And it's known that at Preston Pans, he treated the wounded on both sides. So, it was not a just execution, but on any level. It was just a ruthless signal to anyone who wanted to support the Prince. This is what's going to happen to you. And I believe it's then that the Prince has this breakdown, that he's come face to face with the consequences of what will happen. He's been abandoned by France, obviously. He's not got the support. He's fallen out with his father. He never saw his father again. He's fallen out with his brother. He never saw his brother again until after his father died. And his brother had been a very strong supporter of him in 45. And basically he then descends into alcoholism and what I think post-traumatic stress disorder. So as I say, he's 31, 32 years old at the time. The rest of his life is just one long decline. His political career, his public career is over.